The second part of this third class intend to point out a very specific and maybe a detail in the whole discussion. We want to illustrate some contents that from the deconstruction that flow directly into the cyber architecture. The reason of this discussion, you can call it a sort of exercise of critics. It is a sort of attempt to illustrate a specific detail into the history of contemporary architecture, which we are investigating in the previous years. Of course, it's a sort of illustration of a method, and every one of you could try to do in every direction, in every trend of architecture that you like most. It is possible to demonstrate, and we are trying to do in this lesson, this part of the lesson, that there are some direct connection in between the deconstruction architecture and what we have called the cyber architecture. If you come back with the mind to the deconstructivist architecture, the architecture of Frank Gehry, Zaha Hadid, Libeskind, but also the architect less famous than them, something like Günter Dominik, or even Günter Benisch from Germany, you find a certain kind of characteristics, which is the complexity of the form, the strong feeling of the space, something which can be related with the expressionist architecture somehow. Some element in the architecture of Hans Scharoun, for example, but also Hans Pölzig, but also Hugo Hering, and all the trend from 1920 from Germany somehow flow into the deconstructivist architecture. The deconstructivist architecture was extreme in terms of geometrical challenge, in terms of speculation of space, the advanced use of the material, the complexity of the engineering, the structures and construction. Now, why we are going to point out the relationship in between the construction architecture and computer-aided architecture, cyber architecture? The reason is very clear. If you check several names of the deconstructivist architecture, finally become leading figures in the cyber architecture. I give you a very simple example. Frank Gehry is probably emblematic case. If you check the architecture of Frank Gehry, his method of creation didn't change in the last 50 years. It's always the same. How he create architecture? He used a sort of sculptorial way. He sit in front of the model, cut a piece of paper, organize the paper according with some specific form, and after several change, the model it is fixed. And then what? Well, when he built the Vitra museum, there is very few computer support. So the model made by paper as a sculpture definitely flow into traditional design. But after a few years, the complexity of his architecture, for example, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, required a completely different method of design, engineering. We all know that the engineering of the construction of the building was realized by the company from Italy named Permastilisa. And I personally talked with the manager of that project, and they testify directly to me the extreme difficulties to realize that project. Because, for example, Frank Gehry required them that the joint of the titanium plate should be completely horizontal. It was very difficult to realize that idea. They almost succeed, but with some little mistakes here and there. Without the computer, that building will be never realized, both in terms of design, drawings, and also construction. This is why at the very beginning, Frank Gehry decided to use a very specific software named the CATIA, which originally was used by the car factory, car company, to create the models of the car and then realize the car. We all know that to create a car, automotive industry, it needs a very high precision, even if we are not talking about Rolls-Royce, but even a common car. The design is very complicated. The forms are mostly curved. There is no plain surface. The joints have to be very accurate. The security must be very high. So basically, the design and construction process in the automotive industry, it is very, very high. So Frank Gehry used the software CATIA, which was used for Fiat car, by the way, to manage the project. But there is still a problem. He realized physical model made by paper. This is why in his process of construction of the building, firstly he takes the paper model. He has a very early 3D scan to digitalize all the model, and then finally that model become meshes, line, surfaces, and then it was imported into the computer and then adjusted for the construction. Zaha Hadid, another great genius in the contemporary architecture, started his design as a painter. It's not a case that he was graduated in mathematics. So he has a sort of talent for the advanced surface, non-Euclidean geometry. But at the very beginning, she acted as an artist. She used acrylic colors to create his plan, design, and idea. And then finally, it flowed into architecture. But very early in her production, he started to digitalize her drawings. So another deconstructivist architecture, or at least categorized as deconstructivist, very early, because of the complexity of her architecture, used the computer to create the drawings of the architecture and finally realized. Because of her design was very early based on curved surface, definitely there is the problem to realize, to build this curved surface. Especially with the use of the concrete, this task is not simple at all, because we have to remember that the design of Zaha Hadid it mostly concerns double curved surface. So it is not a simple curve, but they are mostly saddle, curved in both of directions. To manage that kind of curves, it is very difficult using hand sketch or traditional projection. So, computer can do everything very well. During the 1990s, for example, and after 2000 definitely, she used Rhino because it was the only software able to create such kind of complexity, such kind of curves. Then finally, some industry create a new technology for the concrete, for the forms of the concrete, and in order to make it real, those kind of unusual shape of the building. And then she was able to realize what we all know. There is also another case. For example, in the Victoria and Albert Museum made by Daniel Libeskind, the structures is so complicated, the structures is so complex that there is no mathematics able to calculate the forces inside the cube, inside the surface, which join each other. It is very simple to realize a joint in between two forms, two surfaces on computer. But then the problem is how to calculate the forces, how to calculate the stress into the material. Only the computer is able to calculate, to simulate the forces inside the surface which are joined in that specific way. And there are some studies on that. Again, three key masters in the deconstructivist architecture which generate cyber architecture. So, the assumption, a very interesting point, is the reason why those kind of architects generate the very advanced experimentation since the beginning in the cyber architecture. So there are always linkage, connection in between many authors from deconstructivist to cyber. We think that the one hypothesis is the complexity of the space, the complexity of the structures from deconstructivist architecture, make it real, make it possible, the development of the cyber architecture. Simply because the needs, the poetic, the visual culture of the deconstructivist architecture required a much more powerful process of elaboration of the form, which was naturally inside the computer and relative software. There is another important point to mention. Time to time, in the history of architecture, especially in the 20th and 21st century, we find a sort of trend which can be defined as avant-garde. What does it mean, avant-garde? Avant-garde, we all know it is a military term, and it concerns the first line army which intend to attack the enemy. So it is something more brave, more dynamic, more advanced. They risk their life for the benefit of the war. Avant-garde was also a term which was flowed directly into art. For example, all the artists in Paris in between 1900 and 1920, something like Picasso or Léger, the Cubism or the Fauve, they are considered avant-garde. Avant-garde because their aggressivity in terms of the against the history of art was so radical, so violent, then they can be considered a sort of army against the status quo, against the academia. Those kind of avant-garde appear time to time in the history of art and architecture during the 1920s. The Expressionist was avant-garde, but also the Wiener Aktionismus and some extreme expression of body art during the 1960s and 1970s, they were avant-garde. Now, also Zadi, the Gehry, the constructivist, but also the cyber architecture, they can be considered avant-garde. They are people who strongly criticize. They were against the system of architecture at that time, create something extremely innovative, even violent, because the architecture of Gehry and the architecture of Zadi is not quite at all. They are quite aggressive, both in terms of the form and against the academia, against the traditional school of architecture. They finally won, but it was a very sharp battle against traditionalists. Those kind of situation, those kind of discussion, or better, war in between academia and innovative design, it was possible thanks of the development of the technology of the computer. But we have to notice a detail which is quite important in discussion. Can we completely overlap the deconstructivist architecture with the cyber architecture? Of course not. Because probably at the very early stage, some element of the deconstructivist architecture flow into the cyber architecture. But then finally, the cyber architecture developed in his own way. For example, in the contemporary expression of the cyber architecture or computer architecture or architecture computer-based, it is a much more fluent form. The architecture becomes much more organic. The architecture becomes even extreme. There is a sort of advanced conception and integration in between structures and form, space and light. So the very early stage, maybe it came from the constructivist architecture, but then the cyber architecture it developed in his own way. Also because, and we mention once again, architecture generated by a computer has also this strange phenomena of the virtual space. And the virtual space are intriguing because they are very close, very similar to the real space realized by traditional architecture, physical architecture. So, cyber architecture in both of their trend, virtual and physical architecture, somehow they are the two child of the same mother, the same trend. I want to mention in this case, one problem, one weakness, which is very common nowadays in the architecture, the rendering. We all know what is a rendering. A rendering, it is a picture realized by computer and realized by a specific software, which can generate the photorealistic image of the architecture. It looks like a normal picture. It looks like a picture made by camera, but actually it doesn't exist. It is only a trick. It is an elaboration made by the software for design, imported in some other software for generated rendering, and then corrected with Photoshop. Now, the final result is very attractive. It's really charming. Some rendering are so perfect and so good that it's very difficult for the human eyes to distinguish if it is a real picture or if it is a computer rendering. Sometimes it's quite complicated, even impossible, especially in the very latest generation of rendering. We even have some rendering which imitate the face of actor which was already passed away. For example, in the famous movie Star Wars, there are several scenes where the face of the actor are reproduced by computer because the actor is already passed away. And the audience can't understand the difference. So it seems that the actor, which now is already old or even died many years ago, we still can see the performance of them on the screen with exactly the same expression, even very detailed. Now, the capacity, the power of the render is very tricky because architect, client, and basically the audience, the large audience, can be confused by the quality of architecture because of this rendering. What does it mean? It means that a rendering, it is more realistic than the final output, than the final construction. There are many cases where advertisement use rendering to sell on the market a project made by architect. And finally, the rendering is much more beautiful, much more attractive than the final realization. But the problem is, the people buy the picture, the people buy the rendering, and it is a very big difference in between rendering and final result. For example, in terms of space, a rendering, it is basically a picture. But the quality of architecture, as Bruno Zevi said, it is in the space, in the use. This trick, it is clear in front of the common people, in front of the people who is going to buy architecture, but sometimes it becomes a little bit more ambiguous also in the eyes of the architect. Sometimes the architect, especially the young generation, lose the ability to imagine the realistic space, the physical space, because their imagination is limited to the great power of the computer. So there is always ambiguity in between the image generated by computer and what it appears in the final result. Sometimes the final result, the physical architecture, is very disappointing. And this is a problem. The problem is, in this moment, and I think this is a very general trend in all world, there is a progressive ambiguity in between real and virtual. Now, if the ambiguity it is limited on the theoretical problem, it's fine. But the weakness that it is necessary to point out is that there is no discussion, no critical discussion in between virtuality and reality in terms of those kind of image. I strongly believe that there is a big confusion in between what is virtual and what is real. And I notice that this ambiguity is going to be progressively increasing. Now, the important statement here is to recognize that the two areas are completely different. The two areas, they are separate, and confuse the one for the other can be extremely risky. This is particularly true for the young generation which are born, which start the study in architecture with the computer. The older generation, they are much more clear in between reality and virtuality. But the young generation, born with the computer, who start to generate architecture with the computer since the first grade of their study in university, this form of ambiguity, it is absolutely less clear. There are always distance and difference in between reality and virtuality. If the project intentionally intend to be limited in the area of virtuality, there is no problem. It starts as a virtual and it will end as a virtual. There are a lot of, for example, virtual museum over internet with a very interesting form, or logic map that is virtual, and it has to be virtual. It's something very clear, but the confusion in between reality and virtuality, I notice that is a very strong weakness of the contemporary age. And this is valid also in terms of social relationship. There is a lot of ambiguity in between social relationship on computer and in reality. They are two different situations. Sorry, I use wrong terms. Reality, both virtual and physical are reality, but they are two different reality. The social relationship in virtual world and the social relationship in the physical world, they are different. And the big problem is when the two elements are confused. Social relationship can be perfectly fine over internet, in the chat line, in the virtual environment, but if we use the same rule of the virtual social relationship into the physical social relationship, then problem start. We cannot use the same rule in the virtual communication over a chat line inside the physical communication, inside the physical space. For example, the slang, the language that we use commonly in the chat line is completely different inside the physical world. So what I want to mention is this kind of ambiguity have to be end. Virtual and physical space are both real space. Physical architecture and virtual architecture, they are both architecture because involve the sense of the space of the users and the architect. But it's a big mistake to confuse the one for the others. Well, for this section of the class is finished because we touched the key point, and now we have to pass to illustrate some key examples in the cyber architecture using some key project produced in the last 20 or 30 years.